It all started 20 years ago, a night that refuses to fade, no matter how many years pass. There are nights you forget, and then there are nights that change you. Nights so twisted, so impossible, they leave a scar on your mind, your soul, your very reality. This is the story of my night. If you're here watching this, I have one piece of advice. Listen closely. Not for me, for yourself. Because the kind of darkness I'm about to tell you about, it doesn't stop at one person. It spreads. You think you're safe in your own home, behind locked doors, under your warm blankets? You're not. I wasn't. And once you hear what happened, you'll never look at your own door the same way again. Before we start, I need you to do one thing. Hit that like button. Subscribe. Not for me, but to prove you're still here, still safe. Because after this story, you'll want every light you can get. The first thing I remember was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, oppressive kind that feels wrong. You know what I mean? Like the world's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My eyes shot open. I don't even remember dreaming. I was just awake, like something had shaken me out of sleep. I stared at the ceiling, trying to shake off that weird feeling. But then I noticed something. My door. It was wide open. Now, you gotta understand, my door is never open. Never. It's my rule. I don't care if the house is burning down. If I'm in bed, that door stays shut. Locked. Period. But there it was, wide open, like it was mocking me. For a second, I told myself it was just the wind. Maybe someone left a window open, but as I turned my head, I saw it. Her. She was standing there right in the doorway, leaning against the frame like she'd been waiting for me to notice her. Who the hell is that? My voice barely came out. Her skin was pale, too pale, like she hadn't seen the sun in years. Her long, dark hair hung over her shoulders, messy and wet, as if she'd just stepped out of a storm. She was wearing nothing but a black bra, and as my eyes traveled down her body, I realized something that made my stomach drop. She didn't have legs. Where her legs should have been, she just faded into the darkness, like smoke blending into the air. For a moment, I was frozen. My brain was scrambling for an explanation. It's Mom, I thought. It had to be her. Maybe she was sleepwalking or something. Mom, I whispered. My voice cracked as I spoke. Mom, is that you? No answer. She didn't even move. She just stood there, staring. Or at least, I think she was staring. Her eyes, God, her eyes were like black pits, empty and endless. Mom, stop messing around. You're freaking me out. Nothing, not a sound. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering so loud I was sure she could hear it. Mom, seriously, cut it out. But the longer I looked at her, the more I realized something wasn't right. That wasn't my mom. That wasn't anyone I knew. And the air around her, it felt wrong. Heavy, cold, like standing next to an open freezer, except this freezer was sucking the warmth out of my soul. My breath caught as a single thought screamed through my mind. She's not human. I wanted to move. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. My body felt glued to the bed, like she'd pinned me there with just her presence. Mom? My voice was barely a whisper now. I was shaking so hard the bed frame creaked beneath me. Please? Say something. She didn't. Instead, she took a step forward, or rather, she glided. Her legs weren't there, remember? She just moved closer, as if the air itself carried her. That's when I realized I wasn't breathing. I couldn't. The air was thick, suffocating, and all I could think was, this is it. She's going to kill me. Then, suddenly, her head snapped back upright, and she smiled. Not a friendly smile. A predator smile. The kind that says, "You're mine." That's when I lost it. I threw myself back against the headboard and yelled, "Stay away from me, just stay away." But as I blinked, she was gone. Just gone. She'd never been there. The doorway was empty, the air was still. But the fear, that stayed. It was clinging to me, wrapped around me like a second skin. I sat there, shaking, for what felt like hours. I kept staring at the doorway, half expecting her to come back. But she didn't. And then, I heard it. A whisper. "James." My name. Soft, almost gentle. But it wasn't comforting. It was like someone dragging their nails across a chalkboard, except inside my head. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It was everywhere and nowhere, all at once. "James." I didn't stay in that room. I couldn't. Whatever that thing was, I knew it wasn't over. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the room itself was suffocating me. I had to get out, to find someone, anyone, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. I swung my legs off the bed, my feet landing on the cold floor. Every step toward the door felt like a gamble, like she was still there, waiting for me in the shadows. The hallway was pitch black, the kind of darkness that made you feel blind. "Mom." My voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with fear. "Lily? Mark?" Nothing, just silence. I kept moving, feeling my way along the wall, my hand brushing the rough surface as if it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and each breath felt like dragging my lungs through mud. I reached the living room, the faint moonlight through the curtains casting eerie shapes across the floor. That's when I saw her again. Or at least I thought I did. A figure darted past the far end of the room. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but I knew. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, breaking the silence. No answer. Just the faint sound of floorboards creaking in the distance as if someone, or something, was moving away from me. I found myself standing outside my siblings' room, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Mark and Lily shared the room. It was small, but it was theirs. I needed to see them, to make sure they were okay. Maybe they'd laugh at me, tell me I was imagining things, but at least they'd be normal. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning like an old man's knees. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of their nightlight. A little plastic moon on the dresser. "Mark? Lily?" I called out softly, stepping inside. At first, they didn't move. They were both sitting on Mark's bed, their backs to me, staring at the wall. "Hey, you guys okay?" My voice felt small, like it didn't belong in the room. Then slowly, Lily turned her head. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you hear it?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "Hear what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the corner of the room where shadows seemed to gather like a living thing. I turned to look, and for a split second, I thought I saw something. Dark, shapeless, but watching. Always watching. "Stop messing around," I said, trying to sound brave. "This isn't funny." It's not a joke, Mark said suddenly, his voice low and shaky. He finally turned to look at me, and his face was just as pale as Lily's. We've been hearing it all night. The whispers, the footsteps. My stomach dropped. What whispers? They're calling your name, Lily said. Her voice was eerily calm, like she was talking about the weather. James. Over and over again. I felt my legs weaken, like they were about to give out. No, this can't be real. You're just... Look, Mark suddenly shouted, cutting me off. He pointed toward the window, his hand trembling. It's outside. Look! I turned toward the window, the curtains fluttering faintly in the breeze from the cracked glass. And then I saw it. A face. Pale, expressionless, pressed against the window from the outside. The same face I'd seen in the doorway. Her hair hung in limp strands, her black eyes staring directly at me. But it wasn't just her face, it was her hand. It slid down the glass, leaving a streak behind, as if she was trying to claw her way inside. "Oh, close it!" I yelled, running toward the window. I grabbed the curtains and yanked them shut. But even then, I could feel her presence, like she was still there, on the other side of the thin fabric. "She's not gonna leave," Mark muttered, his voice trembling. "She's everywhere." "No," I said firmly, turning to face them. "We're not staying here. We're leaving now." I grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her off the bed, forcing her to move. Mark followed, his steps hesitant but quick. As we made our way down the hallway, the air felt heavier, colder, like the house itself was alive, trying to trap us. The whisper started again. James, come back." This time, Lily and Mark heard it too. Lily clutched my hand tighter, her nails digging into my skin. "James, it's getting louder," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know," I said, my own voice barely steady. "Just keep moving." We reached the front door, but when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was like it had been welded shut. I yanked on it with all my strength, my frustration boiling over. "Damn it, open!" "James?" Mark's voice was faint. I turned to look at him, and his eyes were wide with terror. He was staring back down the hallway. "She's coming." I followed his gaze and froze. She was there, standing at the end of the hallway, her head tilted, her black eyes locked onto mine. But she wasn't alone. The shadows around her seemed to writhe and shift, forming shapes, hands, faces, things I couldn't begin to describe. They were all moving toward us. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Mark and Lily toward the living room. We bolted, cutting through the house like rats in a maze, trying to find another way out. The whispers turned into screams, echoing in my ears, making it impossible to think. We finally made it to the back door. It swung open without resistance, and we stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. For a moment, everything was still. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. "She's not done with us," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Lily looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "What do we do now, James?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the night wasn't over, and neither was she. We stood outside in the cold night air, the three of us huddled together like scared animals. The silence was deafening, broken only by our ragged breathing. For a moment, I let myself believe it was over, that we had escaped, but deep down, I knew better. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent, but its presence felt alive. I could feel her, even out here, watching, waiting. What now? Lily's voice was barely a whisper. She clung to my arm, her small frame trembling. I didn't answer. What could I say? That we were safe? That it was over? Lies. All of it. There was no safety. No escape from something like her. Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. We can't just stand here. We have to do something. He looked at me, his older brother, for answers I didn't have. James, what do we do? I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say a word, the wind picked up, a sudden, violent gust that carried with it a sound that made my blood run cold. James? Lily? Mark? It wasn't a whisper this time. It was loud, sharp, like nails scraping against glass, and it was coming from the house. We're not going back in there, I said, my voice firm, even though my knees felt like they'd buckle any second. No matter what, we stay out here. James. Lily tugged at my sleeve, her voice shaking. She's still calling. She knows our names. Don't listen to her, I said quickly. Whatever you do, don't... I stopped. Mark was no longer standing beside me. Mark! I shouted, spinning around. He was walking back toward the house, his steps slow but deliberate, like he was in a trance. Mark, stop! I screamed, running after him. But no matter how fast I moved, the distance between us seemed to stretch, like the ground itself was betraying me. I can hear her, Mark said, his voice flat, emotionless. She's inside. She's waiting for me. No, she's not, I yelled, my voice cracking. She's lying to you. Mark, stop. But he didn't stop. He reached the back door, which had been wide open just moments ago, and stepped inside. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the ground. I pounded in the door, screaming his name until my throat burned. Mark, come back. Don't do this. Lily was crying now, pulling at my arm. James, we have to leave. Please, we have to go. I'm not leaving him, I shouted, my voice hoarse. I turned back to the door, my fist slamming against it. Mark, open the door. Then I heard it. His scream. It was the kind of scream you never forget, the kind that carves itself into your soul. It was raw, primal, filled with a terror I couldn't begin to understand. And then it stopped. Just stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the scream. It was heavy, suffocating, like the air itself had been drained from the world. Mark, my voice was barely a whisper now. Mark, answer me. Nothing. I turned to Lily, her tear-streaked face staring back at me, wide-eyed and terrified. Stay here, I said, my voice shaking. No, she cried, grabbing my arm. Don't go in there, James. Please, don't leave me. I have to, I said, my heart breaking as I pulled away from her. I can't leave him. I pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness. The air inside was colder than ice, biting at my skin. The house felt different now, bigger, emptier, like the walls had stretched and the shadows had taken on lives of their own. Mark, I called out, my voice echoing unnaturally. There was no response, just the sound of my own footsteps on the creaking floorboards. As I moved deeper into the house, I felt it again, that presence. She was here, somewhere in the darkness, watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as a faint sound reached my ears. It was crying. I followed the sound, my heart pounding with each step. It led me to the living room, where Mark was standing in the center of the room, his back to me. Mark, I said softly, stepping closer. It's me. It's James. I'm here. The voice was impossible to miss. It spilled over my words like a silent rain. He didn't move. Mark? My voice cracked as I reached out to touch his shoulder. He turned around slowly, and the sight made my blood freeze. His eyes were gone, just empty, black sockets staring back at me. His mouth twisted into a smile that didn't belong on his face. She's here, he said, his voice hollow, and she's not done. Before I could react, the shadows around him came alive, twisting and writhing like living things. They reached out, wrapping around his body, pulling him into the darkness. No! I screamed, lunging forward, but it was too late. He was gone. Just gone. I stumbled back, tears streaming down my face. The shadows closed in around me, their whispers growing louder, more menacing. James. I turned and ran, my legs barely carrying me as I sprinted toward the door. I burst outside, gasping for air, and grabbed Lily, pulling her away from the house. Where's Mark? She asked, her voice trembling. I couldn't answer. I couldn't even look at her. The house stood behind us, dark and silent, as if it had consumed him whole. I felt the weight of the lost hit me like a freight train. Mark was gone, and it was my fault. I should have stopped him. I should have saved him. But I didn't. That night changed everything. We never went back to that house. We couldn't. But it didn't matter. She followed us. I still hear her sometimes, in the dead of night, calling my name. Lily hears it too. She doesn't say it out loud, but I can see it in her eyes. We are haunted by what happened, by what we saw, by what we lost. And now, so are you. Be careful, that was my part of the story. If something, even sometime, happens to you, tell me in the comments. And the best advice is, you should do something about it, or it might take your loved ones.